It is a real honor to moderate this very important discussion on Middle East magnetics. I think if we think about the ways in which conflict and realignment have rattled the world, you'd be hard-pressed to find a more volatile and complex set of challenges than those that are roiling the Middle East. And I can think of no better set of panelists to help unpack these complex dynamics than the colleagues who are seated with me on the stage this morning. Let me briefly introduce them, and then we're going to dive right into the discussion. To my immediate left, Kamran Bokhari is founder and senior director of Eurasian Security and Prosperity at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy here in Washington, D.C. He brings 15 years of experience in the private sector intelligence space, where he's published cutting-edge geopolitical analysis and forecasts. Next to Kamran, we have Brian Katulis, who is a senior fellow for U.S. foreign policy at the Middle East Institute. He was formerly a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he built the center's Middle East program, and he's worked on issues broadly related to U.S. national security. And last, but certainly not least, Aaron David Miller. He's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, focusing on U.S. foreign policy. Throughout his long and, I would say, storied career, Aaron has published 5 books and held numerous positions at the State Department, including senior advisor for Arab-Israeli negotiations and deputy special Middle East coordinator. So with that, let's dive right in. The conflict in Gaza has endured now for nearly 14 months. And it has really grabbed newspaper headlines during that time. I'm sure most, if not all of you, are familiar with the broad outlines of the conflict, which was provoked by Hamas and its unprecedented attack on Israel on October 7th of last year. What I'd like to do is kind of dive more deeply into the complex dynamics that are reverberating beyond Gaza. I'd also like us to talk a bit about global realignments as we see them in the Middle East. And then I want us to talk a bit about U.S. national security interests, foreign policy implications, and certainly how we should understand both the challenges and opportunities for the incoming Trump administration. So that's a big agenda, and I want to get to as much of it as I can, and then also, of course, bring all of you in for questions and comments. So let me start, Aaron, if I could, with you. And you've devoted your career to working on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Can you help us understand how what has unfolded over the past 14 months is different from previous iterations of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? What distinguishes what we're seeing today from all the various levels of conflict that we've seen over the last 70 years?
Yeah, thanks, Mona. And it's great to be here with my fellow panelists and in Washington at this meeting of the World Affairs Council. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict didn't begin on October 7, and sadly, tragically, it's not going to end anytime soon. What distinguishes October 7 and Israel's effort to prosecute a war against Hamas are several things. Number one, the last trauma, which would have been October 6, 1973, when Egypt crossed the canal and inflicted a degree of pain on the Israeli military, was the greatest intelligence failure in Israel's history and the greatest trauma. October 7th went beyond that. The initial 24 to 48 hours of Hamas's attacks, the willful indiscriminate killing of civilians, the sexual predation, the torture, the taking of hostages, created not just trauma, but a major crisis of confidence, both in Israel's intelligence organizations and its militaries. It was not just an intelligence failure. It was an operational failure, because for almost 48 hours, the Israeli Defense Forces failed to respond in a way to stop the killing. And again, unlike October 6, 1973, it was primarily the killing of civilians. The Israeli response, a blockade of Gaza for 2 weeks in which nothing got in or out, an air campaign which took, at least during the first several weeks, anywhere from 4,000 to 7,000 Palestinian deaths, primarily civilians. And then the prosecution of the war inflicted a degree of pain and suffering on Palestinians that was unprecedented in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Nakba, the catastrophe between 1947 and 1949 resulted in the deaths of 15,000 Palestinians and the displacement, forced and caught up in the chaos of war, of almost 750,000 people. October 7th, both with respect to inflicting trauma and pain and loss of confidence in the future, and even in their respective governing authorities, separates this phase of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from any other phase in its devastation, its trauma, and its pain. I'll just close with one additional point. I happened to be in Jerusalem on October 6, 1973, and within 4 years of that intelligence failure and conflict, within 4 years, I watched on the White House lawn Anwar Sadat, Menachem Begin, and Jimmy Carter sign a full treaty of peace. I make this point for 2 reasons. Number one, for those who say that it's hopeless, we need to surrender to the forces of hopeless and despair. The reality is I'm 75 years old. One thing I know for sure, I cannot see what is in front of me, for good or ill, and I would caution those who have given up on the prospects for a solution not to do so. That's the good news. The bad news is that I do not see now the counter to the trauma of October 7th. I saw it clearly watching Begin, Sadat, and Carter sign a full treaty of peace. I do not see it now. And that, to me, is the greatest challenge going forward. Sorry to drone on, Mona, but it's a very important point.
No, I think it's hugely important, because I think we, in order to understand the reverberations of Gaza, we need to understand the significance of it in terms of how it's distinct from other iterations of the conflict. I want to draw you out, if I could, just for a moment, a little bit further, because we are, the theme, of course, of the conference, seeing from the other side. You've talked about the level of trauma experienced in Israel by the attack. Can you talk a little bit more about Israeli domestic politics and how those politics affect the trajectory of this conflict?
It's a very important point. Henry Kissinger once quipped that Israel had no foreign policy. It only had domestic politics. It's an exaggeration to be sure, but I think it has been demonstrated with a terrifying clarity over the course of the last 14 months. And let me be very clear here. I've worked with any number of Israeli prime ministers of different parties, including Benjamin Netanyahu during his first term. He's the longest governing prime minister in the history of the state of Israel. Unfortunately, sadly, he is the wrong leader at the wrong time at a critical moment in this country's history and the history of the region. On trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust in a Jerusalem district court, 4 years in running. He's due to testify next month. Despite his efforts to get that delayed, the judges have refused. And unfortunately, many of the decisions that Mr. Netanyahu has made over the course of the last 14 months, particularly with respect to Gaza, has been subordinated and tethered to his determination, above all else, it is the organizing principle of his life, to remain in power. If he does not remain in power, then his future is bleak. He could be convicted. Ehud Olmert, one of his predecessors, went to prison for 14, 16 months for one of the charges that Mr. Netanyahu is accused of. And if he isn't convicted, the only other option is to cut a plea agreement, which would essentially mean the end of his political career. So for him, staying in power is everything. And sadly, as I see it, I'm not an Israeli, but as I analyze Israel's policies, his numbers have been going up. Israel's escalation dominance against Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas have buoyed the confidence in the Israeli Defense Forces. And the government, which will go to term in 2026, it's reasonable to conclude that for the foreseeable future, Benjamin Netanyahu will remain prime minister.
So, Brian, I want to turn to you now because I'd like us to sort of expand out a bit and understand the various reverberations of the Gaza conflict across the region. We've seen multiple flashpoints erupt since October 7th of last year, some into major conflict, as we're seeing in Lebanon. Elsewhere, we're seeing other kinds of impacts that I think none of us as analysts would have predicted, like the Houthis essentially impeding Red Sea shipping. Help us understand, maybe first I'd like you to start by sketching out the various regional reverberations of the Gaza conflict.
It's huge, and first, thank you, Mona and Kamran and Aaron. It's great to be up here with some great scholars and friends, and I really appreciate the work that the World Affairs Councils do across the country. I can't stress enough, especially the phase that we're about to come into as a nation, to have people out there gathering people to talk about the world and all of its complexities. Mimi had me down in Naples with my son, Ben, earlier this year, timed for spring training, and Joyce, I'm from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, so you guys know where to reach me. One of my great joys in life is to get out of our bubble here and talk about what's going on in the region. I just came back from the region last night, got in at 10 p.m., and I was speaking at a conference hosted by the Emirati foreign minister, and many foreign ministers from across the region were there. To answer your question very precisely and not go on forever, essentially a lot of the pre-existing conditions, the weaknesses that were in the Middle East and across the Middle East have erupted in response to Hamas's initial attack and Israel's response. And this is all very much interlinked. The hip bone is connected to the leg bone. And anyone who thinks that these things aren't interlinked, they're missing the big story, or you're not paying attention to how the main story, or at least for the first few months of the war between Israel and Hamas, how that was playing out in the media across the region, including in conventional media. But the three, I would say four biggest flashpoints, Kamran can talk about the fourth. One you mentioned is Lebanon, and that had been a situation since 2006. We were talking before the panel that there were flare-ups, but essentially there was a tenuous calm at that point. But I think Hamas shocked everybody, including Iran and Hezbollah, in its ferocity in its initial attack. But the tit-for-tat escalation that we've seen grow over the last year between Israel and Hezbollah has passed this point of perhaps no return. We'll see if Amos Hochstein gets some sort of deal or whether it will sustain itself. But the losses that Hezbollah has suffered just in the last 2 or 3 months are unprecedented. It's historic. The depth of what Israel's been able to do to that movement as both a political and terrorist organization is quite stark. You know it very well. But I don't think that's the end of the story, even if they get to some sort of deal. So that's one arena. The second arena you already mentioned, which is the Houthis, which is a group that now controls Yemen. I had the pleasure of meeting with the Houthi leadership in Oman in 2019. If anyone wants to hear that story, I can tell you about it in the Q&A. But God bless Tim Lenderking and any other envoy that have to deal with these representatives, because some former diplomats are in the room, like Larry Silberman and others. It's really not an easy thing to do. They've essentially used the moment to chip away at the not only regional order but global order, and to demonstrate common cause with Hamas and other political movements in what is sometimes known as the axis of resistance that Iran has organized. Third front are the various militias in Iraq and in Syria, where the U.S. still has a presence, at least for now, a troop presence, and it complicates the effort that is still ongoing against the Islamic State. Some of the Iranian-backed militias have been quite deadly. If you recall, just earlier this year in January, 3 U.S. soldiers killed in Jordan as a result of this. So these arenas are very much interlinked. And then the fourth is of course, and Kamran will talk about this, he's an excellent specialist, the Iran arena. We had 2 incidents this year where Israel and Iran, I would argue, have been in a decades-long shadow war for a long period of time. That came out into the open in April, and then more recently, just last month, in an exchange of fire that, though pretty constrained, and I think because of U.S. engagement in the region, because of the cooperative frameworks we've developed over the years with some of our partners, the tit for tat that became open between Israel and Iran was fairly constrained. Quite often in the Middle East, the thing, if you follow the Middle East like we do at the Middle East Institute, go figure, the main thing you often say is it could have been worse, and most certainly in these instances, a lot of behind-the-scenes efforts diplomatically, militarily, to constrain both what Iran and Israel were doing directly to one another. We'll see where all of that goes. I'm sure we're going to get to the Trump questions, because in essence, a president who is deeply uncertain and prided himself in his unpredictability is meeting a region right now that is also at probably its most unpredictable moment we've seen in years.
I certainly agree with that assessment. I'd like to stick with you for a moment, though, Brian, and maybe have you unpack a little further the role that these non-state actors are playing, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. In particular, I'm interested in having you help us understand, to what extent are they in fact a unified front, as they certainly tried to portray early after October 7th. They have this whole vaunted idea of the unity of fronts and almost kind of their own sort of, I don't know, non-state actor NATO or something that where they were trying to sort of pursue these objectives together but separately. So that's part one, and part two is a deeper question. You and I have talked about this a little bit, and that is the whole question of deterrence in the Middle East. When we have the prominence of these non-state actors, some with little, if anything, to lose, and here I'm thinking about the Houthis, who, with all that the U.S. and our allies have done militarily to try to deter them, they continue. They continue to strike. So how should we be thinking, first, about these non-state actors, second, about sort of traditional ideas of deterrence in now a rapidly evolving Middle East?
Those are big questions, and I'll try to be brief. On the first one, from a state stability, state system, and security standpoint, I think these terror groups and militias operate like a termite in your home, meaning that they chip away at the established order. They take advantage of those places that have weak governance. You've written a lot about all of this. And they fill the space that has been left empty by not only poor governance, but corruption and orders that actually aren't responsive to their own people. So that's one way in which they operate, and it does complicate how one looks at, especially if you have a framework that's more of a realist framework that looks at regions like the Middle East or the world, just from a state-centric standpoint, and it really complicates things in many ways, which leads to your second question. But a second role that they play, I would say that it's often overstated how much they're coordinated. I do think that they're singing from the same sheet of music, and the ideologies that they often have are in similar ways. But if you remember during the ISIS crisis when it first began, there were groups, and including the Israeli Prime Minister, Aaron talked about, who tried to lump all of these groups together, which analytically was just not helpful, but also from a policy and process standpoint, to say that Hamas and the Islamic State are the same. You're making all sorts of big mistakes that then could lead you down to sort of bad policy choices. But it is a fact that that group of Islamists, some Sunni, some Shia, they offer a different worldview than the powers that be in the region right now. And if you consider the dominant powers that be, it's the ones that have the money, the weapons. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the weaker states, Jordan, are sort of pinched by all of these different forces. So I think that's, it shows sort of briefly, I hope, the complexities of the region and how these non-state actors. On your second question, I just think the notions of classic deterrence. Israel right now is facing a war of attrition on multiple fronts from many of these non-state actors, yes, with some backing from Iran, but the notion that you can just simply have a military approach to all of this without some sort of political horizon that squeezes and marginalizes these extremist voices. And it's the thing we didn't get right in years of fighting Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. We never got it fully complete, is that other component, the non-kinetic component, I see no plan coming from the current Israeli government. I heard a lot of talk last week in Abu Dhabi about people being willing to actually do a lot more in Gaza if there was some sort of political horizon. And that's a new, unprecedented thing, and I hope we can get to what I call the silver linings playbook for the Middle East, because as bad as it is, there's actually forces in play that even with all of the uncertainty and of President Trump and the region, there are avenues, I think, that could lead to sort of better outcomes than we've seen the last couple of years.
So hold that thought, because we definitely want to get to silver linings playbooks when we talk about the Middle East. But I'd like to turn to you, Kamran, to talk about Iran. So we've mentioned it a couple times, but Iran really is, I think, in many ways, one of the key regional actors at play here in this unfolding drama. We've noted that it's not once but twice that Iran has directly struck Israel from its soil. So essentially, the crossing of a Rubicon, of this specter of direct confrontation between Iran and Israel. Help us understand Iran's role, how it's evolving in the region. The latest round was a counter-response by Israel against Iran. Is that the end of the back and forth, or are there more rounds to come?
Thank you, Mona. It's great to be with Aaron and Brian. Thank you, World Affairs Council, for inviting us. I think that Iran, first of all, if we step back, the Middle East is by and large, and I talk about it from a driver's point of view, the drivers of conflict. It's a two-player game. First of all, there are four major powers in the Middle East. You have Turkey, Israel, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Turkey has not played a role, and we can get into the reasons for why it hasn't over the past 14 months. And Saudi Arabia has played a secondary role, but it's not a driver of addressing the conflict or even a player, as are Israel and Iran. Essentially, this is a two-player game. Until, let's just say, the past 2-3 months, we had a trend line for decades where Iran was asserting itself in the region. The various actors that Brian talked about earlier, they're a part of its regional national security strategy or strategy to expand its influence in the region. And Iran was aggressively pushing in, making use of different developments over the decades. We can go back to pre-Arab Spring as well, but the Arab Spring, the US invasion of Iraq, the 9/11 attacks, all of these allowed and enabled Iran to expand its influence, establish these proxies. Definitely the Houthis are a product, at least from, in the sense of Iran backing them, is essentially the post-Arab Spring. The Houthis were there before, the Iranians were definitely supporting them, but it was low level. The Arab Spring really opened up the opportunity for the Iranians. Now, what we had is a trend line in which the Iranians were engaged in deep ingress into the Middle East. And ultimately, this was bound to happen. The Israeli-Iranian confrontation was bound to happen because if you are pushing into the Levant, if you are trying to establish, now I'm one of those who thinks that the Iranians know better than to pick a fight with, direct fight that would hurt them with the Israelis. They know they're no match for the Israelis. They know the variance between their conventional capabilities and the Israeli conventional capabilities is huge. Their goal has been to leverage the Arab-Israeli conflict to expand their influence, to assume sort of a leadership role in the Arab world at a time when Arab states have not been able to provide that role. That's been their strategy. Now, if you do that and you continue to expand across the northern rim of the Middle East from from Iraq through Syria through Lebanon and establish what is a contiguous sphere of influence, then it was inevitable that you're going to run into the Israelis and have a conflict, especially if you are the principal backer of Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is your premier proxy in the region. The expansion of relations with Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, only added to this dynamic. And so I think that is something that the Iranians have been doing, and I think that strategy peaked out, and now we're in a reverse situation where Iran is facing losses. So this isn't just a loss for Hezbollah in Lebanon. This is decades of investment on the part of the Iranians that have now taken a hit. If you are the Assad regime in Syria and you've been dependent on Hezbollah and you've been dependent on Iran to maintain power, then you're looking at the current moment and saying, I want to be still in power when everything is said and done. In other words, I don't want to go down with this trend line. The big question is, how much is the Assad regime dependent on the Iranians and Hezbollah to maintain security at home? Their militias are still there. We know that Hezbollah and the IRGC-QF have maintained a management role, an overseeing role. So if now with Iran and Israel directly going at each other, and I'd like to add that the strategy of using proxies, in my opinion, for the moment has run its course. And now that is why Iran has been forced into this position where it has to go and get directly involved. It is no other choice because your credibility is on the line. Now that's another thing, coming back to the latest strike that the Israelis conducted, I believe it was October 26th, that has created another conundrum for the Iranians. And to answer your question, Mona, if the Iranians continue to escalate, which so far they haven't because we have a new development in Washington that is also reshaping the entire calculus of all these actors, particularly that of Iran. But if they continue to escalate, then they risk exposing more weakness, and they risk losing more ground in the region, and particularly at home. And finally, I'd like to say that all of this is happening to Iran at a moment when Iran is going through a historic transition at home. The Supreme Leader is 85 years old, and there's a pending transition of Supreme Leadership. It's going to be not just another person taking over, but a real shift in the balance of power within that country. So there is a domestic transition underway at a time when Iran is facing losses on the regional scale.
So you actually answered my follow-up question, which was going to be about domestic politics in Iran and the succession question. I want to keep the conversation moving here, and so Brian, I'm going to turn to you because I'd like to now talk a bit about this idea of regional realignments. How do we understand the Middle East in an increasingly multipolar world? And in my view, it is an increasingly multipolar world, and we're seeing regional actors have far greater agency in dictating and determining their future. Brian, you're just back from the Gulf. Tell us a bit about what you're hearing directly from Gulf stakeholders in terms of how the conflict is evolving. Of course, I'm sure, and we are going to talk more about the U.S. election, but I can only imagine that the re-election or the election to Donald Trump to a second term had to be high on the list. Tell us a bit about what you picked up from your recent trip in terms of the region and how it's evolving.
So first, quite obviously, they're anchored in the current moment, which is quite horrible in Gaza and Lebanon, and fearful of an expansion of the conflict. And my remarks are not just based on what I heard from Gulf leaders, but also there were Jordanians, senior Israeli advisors to Netanyahu were there, which is an interesting new dynamic, as well as some Palestinian leaders and Egyptians as well. So they're anchored in the ugly moment right now, and they think, when they look at Trump 2.0, there's a tendency I think we all have is to look for the positives in a lot of things. The bottom line is they all understand that he's a very unpredictable man, and a lot of the sort of chatter about the appointments just raised more question marks about how much the Middle East will actually matter in the agenda relative to immigration or China policy and things like that. But if I would, and they were very much anchored in sort of current perceptions about the Biden administration, which I think across the board is not very positive. I mean, I think historians will read, and I've done my own assessments, which you could look at online at the Middle East Institute, quarterly assessments of how they've handled the war with grades and things like this. And I think bottom line is that the current administration is seen as fairly weak and ineffective in achieving its own self-stated goals, whether it's a ceasefire or hostage release or preventing a wider regional war, which has just expanded. But I think in this moment, and you said it, Mona, is that many of the countries in the region themselves see themselves as having agency, that they see the uncertainty and the pendulum swings in US politics motivating them and incentivizing themselves to just hedge in the world. It is definitely the geopolitical moment is one of multipolarity, and they are actors that will continue to engage in that. Last thing I'd say is if there were two positives and two negatives, the hopes about a Trump administration and then the fears. First, there's very strong hope, especially amongst these rich countries, that it's let's make a deal time, meaning financially in a very big way. I sort of joked, and it's only a half joke, that I think the Trump administration, the first administration, President Trump ran his administration like a Middle East dictatorship. So some of the people over there see themselves, a bit of themselves in the previous Trump administration. They're like, somebody was joking with me, you Americans finally get it. You put someone in charge in the family business who's the head of it, and you bring some of the family members into the administration. You keep some in the family business to make money, and maybe there's an opportunity here. But a sense, and one diplomat has said to me, under Democrats, you get all process and not outcomes. Under Trump, we get outcomes but no process. So some hope for things like CFIUS reform and more investments and things like that. Second hope for the possibility, and Aaron probably will say a lot about this, of an Israel-Saudi normalization accord, which is still on the horizon, not likely, I think, to occur in the lame duck. Two risks highlighted, and they're linked. One is the very real risk of annexation of the West Bank by Israel. This was a risk in the first Trump administration, forestalled in part by the Abraham Accords as part of that deal, but some deep concerns about Mike Huckabee as the appointed nominee for Trump's ambassador to Israel. And then a second concern, I mentioned it before, is just how much will the region matter, and will US-China tensions, which I'm sure you're talking about, the trade and tariff war likely to unfold. How much will that spill over to this region? To close out, that one thing that's changed under Biden, and I think started under Trump and will continue, is the Middle East, I think under Obama, was seen as a region that we would pivot away from or rebalance from to deal with Asia and with Europe. I think increasingly the common theme in Biden's team, and I think the Trump team 2.0, is that the Middle East is actually an arena for geopolitical competition on multiple fronts, not just military, but tech, investments with a lot of these global powers. So it'll be interesting to see how the new administration teases all of this out in a policy.
So I'm going to want to bring the audience in very soon, but I would be remiss if I didn't turn to you, Aaron, first, and then briefly Kamran also. But Aaron, sketch out for us as we're looking at a presidential transition here in the U.S. What's at stake for the U.S.? What are our key interests? What are the opportunities? And what are the real challenges that the incoming administration is going to face?
I'll begin with a judgment because it affects not just. I'll begin with the judgment because it doesn't just affect the incoming administration. It's affected the last 4 or 5 administrations. In my view, the Middle East is not, by and large, a land of great opportunity for American interests. We have a conundrum. We cannot transform the region. Iraq and Afghanistan, the 2 longest wars in American history, demonstrated that with a frightening clarity. Thousands of Americans were killed. Scores of thousands were injured with life-crushing injuries from which they will never recover. American military managed to kill thousands of innocent Iraqis and Afghans as well. And the standard for victory was never could we win, in my judgment, but when could we leave? All right, so no transformation. On the other hand, no extrication. We cannot leave the region. We have allies, adversaries, interests, equities in this region. That is the challenge for American policy in this region. It has not been met. The only administration, I think, that found that balance, and I'm not an objective observer here, was the last Secretary of State that I believe that was consequential. I had the honor and privilege of working for him, and that was James Baker, with Bush 41 as president. My own view, there are no rewind buttons on history here, but if Bush 41, and I voted and worked for Democrats and Republicans, let me make it very clear. Had Bush 41 defeated Bill Clinton and had Baker remained Secretary of State and Rabin not have been murdered, I think we would have had one agreement, either between Israel and the Palestinians, probably more likely, between Israel and Syria, and maybe the conversation we're having here would have been different. Leadership is critically important, and the region lacks it. And in view of what's coming, I think that may be doubly true. Mona and I were talking about earlier, one final comment. Mr. Trump has no real conception, in my judgment, of the national interest. His policies are subordinated to his whims and fancies, his financial interests, his vanity, and his politics. He's transactional, opportunistic. The good news here is that there may well be a transaction to be made between the Israel and the Saudis. So he'll be transactional abroad, and I fear potentially transformative at home with 3 dimensions. Number 1, the Justice Department. Number 2, the Pentagon. And number 3, the intelligence communities. These are the 3 agencies which have frustrated, angered, and in his view, come after him. Not necessarily in Trump 1.0, but between Trump 1.0 and now. And that's why I think the real fight is not going to be abroad. The real fight for the American Republic is going to be here at home.
So, I think we're getting the hook, unfortunately. What I would encourage you all to do in the brief period we have between now and the next session is ask Kamran the question I was going to ask him, which is what is the prospect of a new U.S.-Iran deal under Trump? But we can't ask that here on stage. Please join me in thanking our terrific panelists.